You wake up at 5:47 a.m., which annoys you slightly because you set no alarm and your body still insists on beating the sun by exactly 13 minutes. There is no discipline in this. There is no morning routine you read about in a magazine. Your circadian rhythm simply calibrated itself years ago and never asked for your opinion again. The house is 3,200 square feet on 4 acres, and if you dropped a real estate agent into your driveway blindfolded, they'd guess upper-middle-class dentist. Built in 1998. You bought it for $610,000 14 years ago, back when the number in your brokerage account still had commas you counted manually. It's worth $1.4 million now. You have not renovated the kitchen. The cabinets are the same oak they've always been. People assume wealth announces itself. Yours has spent 2 decades learning to whisper. You are worth $3.8 billion. Nobody at the gate of your subdivision knows this. Not the mail carrier. Not the man 3 houses down who asked last spring if you'd consider going in on a shared lawn service. You said yes. You split it 4 ways with people worth, combined, maybe $2 million, and none of them find that strange because strange requires suspicion, and nobody suspects the guy who mows every other Saturday. You put on a gray t-shirt you've owned since a conference in 2011. You own 6 of them, identical, because somewhere along the way you realized decision fatigue is a tax on people who haven't figured out which decisions don't matter. Clothing doesn't matter. You decided this before it was a productivity hack. You decided it because your father wore the same Navy work shirt to the plant for 22 years and never once looked like a man agonizing over his closet. Downstairs, you make coffee in a machine you bought in 2009. It still works. You have never once considered replacing it. Not because you can't afford a new one, you could buy the company that manufactures it, but because it does the one job it was built to do, and completed jobs don't need replacing. While the coffee brews, you open a laptop. Not to check the market. You haven't personally checked a stock ticker in 11 years. You have people for that. An actual team. A family office with 9 employees whose entire job is to make sure you never have to think about liquidity, tax exposure, or rebalancing. What you check instead is a single encrypted dashboard, updated weekly, showing the 4 things that actually matter: cash position, concentration risk, upcoming capital calls, and anything requiring your signature. This morning there's one item. A logistics company you hold a 34% stake in needs your sign-off on a $40 million expansion into 2 new distribution hubs. You read the summary. 3 paragraphs. You type approved and close the laptop. 90 seconds, maybe less. That's the whole relationship you have with 9 figures moving across a spreadsheet. The emotional intensity of paying a parking meter. Here is the actual portfolio, if anyone ever asked, which they don't, because billionaires don't get invited to explain themselves at dinner parties. People simply assume the number is self-evident and stop being curious about the mechanics. $1.9 billion sits in a diversified operating business, the one you actually built, a mid-sized industrial supply company you started at 29 with $340,000 and 2 employees who are still with you, now running divisions instead of forklifts. $940 million sits in public equities, spread and boring on purpose, because you learned decades ago that genius is a liability disguised as a virtue. $410 million sits in commercial real estate, warehouses mostly, unglamorous buildings full of pallets nobody photographs for Instagram. $310 million in private credit and fixed income, doing the quiet work of preserving capital while everyone else chases returns. And $240 million in cash and near-cash equivalents, which sounds enormous until you realize that's roughly 18 months of total obligations across every entity you're responsible for. Payroll, philanthropic commitments, capital calls, family trusts. Cash isn't dead weight at this scale. It's oxygen. It's the difference between negotiating from strength and negotiating from panic. You haven't sold a meaningful equity position in over a decade. Not in 2020, when your public portfolio dropped $310 million in 6 weeks, and your phone would not stop vibrating with people who wanted to know if you were doing anything. You did nothing. You bought more, actually, quietly, through the family office, at prices that now look almost unfair in hindsight. Not in 2022 either, when a board member, Nervous, well-meaning, suggested trimming exposure just to be safe. You asked him one question. Safe from what exactly? He didn't have an answer. Neither did the market, eventually. This is the part nobody selling seminars ever explains. At $3.8 billion, the math is no longer the interesting part. The interesting part is what the money stopped requiring of you. It stopped requiring your attention. It stopped requiring your fear. It became, functionally, weather. Something happening, worth noting, never worth managing personally. You drive yourself to the office in a 2019 Tahoe with 61,000 miles on it. You bought it used, 3 years old, cash, the same way you've bought every vehicle since you were 26 and swore off financing anything that depreciates. At a light, a Bentley Bentayga pulls up beside you, gleaming, dealer plates still on it. You don't know the driver. You don't need to. Statistically, there's a 70% chance that car is leased, and there's an even higher chance the man behind the wheel is optimizing for a feeling you stopped needing decades ago. The feeling of being seen. You used to want that too, once, for about 18 months in your early 30s, right after your first real exit, when you bought a watch you can't remember the name of now, and wore it to a dinner where nobody looked at your wrist even once. That was the whole lesson, delivered for free. The light turns green. He accelerates like the car is chasing something. You drive the speed limit, sipping coffee from a mug with a chipped handle, and you think, not smugly, just factually, that the mug has outlasted more relationships in his life than his car ever will. Here's the part that surprises people. When they eventually find out what you're worth, which happens rarely and always by accident, you still go to an office, 4 days a week. You still sit in on operational meetings for the industrial supply business, the one you started, the one that made you rich before it made you unrecognizably rich. You are not the CEO anymore. You stepped back from that title 9 years ago, but you sit on the board, and twice a month you walk the warehouse floor and talk to people whose names you still remember, because remembering names is one of maybe 4 skills that actually compounds. You work not because you need the money. Every dollar the business generates for you personally is now, mathematically, a rounding error against your net worth. But because idle billionaires are a special kind of miserable that nobody warns you about. Purpose doesn't retire just because capital does. At 9:40, your CFO, a woman named Elena who has worked with you for 16 years and who could, by any reasonable standard, retire tomorrow herself, stops you near the coffee station. "Can I run something by you? Off the record?" You nod. "My son's asking me about investing. He's 23, just started his first real job, and he keeps asking me what stock to buy." I don't know what to tell him that doesn't sound like a lecture. You could tell her about diversification, about time horizons, about the 40 pages of due diligence your team runs before touching a single position. Instead, you say, the only thing that's ever actually mattered. Tell him the stock doesn't matter nearly as much as never touching the money he sets aside. The picking is theater. The not selling is the whole show. She laughs, a little surprised, like she expected something more complicated from a man worth what you're worth. You don't correct her. You've learned that the most useful truths about money are almost insultingly simple, and people trust complexity more than simplicity because complexity feels like it was earned. By 10:30, you're in a meeting about a meeting, a pre-call to align on talking points for a call happening Thursday about a partnership that won't close for another 4 months. You sit through it with the calm of a man who understands that most organizational urgency is theater performed for an audience of executives who need to feel busy. Time, at your level of wealth, has stopped being a resource you protect and started being a resource you simply observe, the way you'd watch weather pass over a field you own but never farm yourself. Lunch is a sandwich made that morning, wrapped in foil, sitting in a bag next to 3 other identical sandwiches in the office refrigerator. Yours and 3 employees. Indistinguishable, because you've never seen the point of a different lunch than the people who report to you. Someone new to the company once assumed the sandwich belonged to a facilities guy. You didn't correct that either. Being underestimated has never once cost you anything. If anything, it's been the cheapest insurance you've ever carried. While you eat, you read. Not market news, not financial commentary, none of the noise that convinced an entire generation that watching numbers move constitutes doing something. You gave that up 19 years ago, back when you still checked prices 4 times a day, like a man checking a wound to see if it's healing. It never was. The checking was the wound. Near the window, a junior analyst is on his phone, watching some position tick red, jaw tight, the way a jaw gets when a number feels personal. You recognize it instantly, because you carried that exact tightness in your own jaw for almost 2 years in your early 30s, before you understood that the market doesn't know your name, doesn't know your rent, doesn't know that you need it to go up. It simply moves, indifferent, and the only people who suffer for that indifference are the ones who forgot to expect it. Your phone buzzes. It's not your office. It's an old friend from college, someone you haven't built a business with, haven't invested alongside, just a person who's known you since before any of the zeros existed. His voice has that particular strain in it, the one you've heard before, the one that means the sentence coming next has been rehearsed in a bathroom mirror. "I hate asking you this," he says. "My daughter's tuition payment bounced. I'm $22,000 short, and the school's threatening to pull her enrollment mid-semester." You already know what you're going to do before he finishes the sentence. You tell him to send the account details, and you tell him it's not a loan, and you already know he'll insist it is, and you already know you'll never bring it up again regardless of what he says. The transfer, the afternoon reflection on what $22,000 actually costs you versus what it saves someone else, the temptation of an extravagant purchase, the story of how the fortune was actually built, and the walk home into evening. You transfer the $22,000 before you've even finished chewing. It moves from an account you rarely think about, one that exists specifically for moments like this, not emergencies in the dramatic sense, just the ordinary financial weather that hits people who don't have $3.8 billion standing between them and a bounced tuition payment. The transfer completes in under a minute. Your friend texts back 3 exclamation points and a promise to pay you back by spring. You already know you'll forget this conversation happened by Thursday, and he'll remember it for the rest of his life. Here's the math nobody puts in a headline. $22,000 is 0.000058% of your net worth. It is, statistically, less significant to your financial position than a rounding error in a currency conversion. For your friend, it was the difference between his daughter finishing a semester with her classmates or finishing it through an appeals process and a part-time job that would have cost her the GPA she needed for a scholarship she's been chasing since she was 15. You didn't solve a math problem. You deleted a variable from someone's life that would have compounded, quietly, for years. No fund in your portfolio returns like that. None of them are supposed to. This is the part of extreme wealth nobody explains accurately, because the people explaining it either don't have it or are performing having it. At a certain number, money stops being a tool you use for yourself and becomes something closer to a permanent, low-hum utility you extend to the small number of people who occupy the actual architecture of your life. Not strangers. Not causes with polished names and slick fundraising decks. Those exist too, and you fund several, but through structures designed specifically so you never have to think about them daily. This was different. This was a phone call from someone who's known you since before you had money to call anyone about. Mid-afternoon, there's a moment that would surprise people who assume billionaires float above temptation the way saints float above sin. A boat, not a yacht, just a genuinely nice sport fisher, the kind you've admired at the marina for 2 years without buying, goes up for sale from a man liquidating quickly for a divorce. $2.4 million. You could buy it before your coffee gets cold. Your finger actually hovers over the email from the broker. Then you run the same 3 questions you've run for every major purchase since you were rich enough for purchases to stop being decisions and start being reflexes. 1. Will this matter to me in a year? 2. Am I buying the boat, or am I buying the version of myself that owns a boat? Tanned, unbothered, photographed occasionally by someone else's phone at the dock. 3. Who exactly am I buying this for? You sit with the 3rd question the longest, the way you always do, because it's the only one that's ever lied to you before. The honest answer arrives slower than you'd like. Some fraction of you, small, embarrassing, still alive after all these years, wants Rick from 3 doors down, or the board member who suggested trimming exposure in 2022, or some version of a person from 30 years ago who never believed you'd amount to this, to see the boat and understand something they were never going to understand from a balance sheet. You close the email, not because you can't afford the boat, you could buy 40 of them and never notice the dent, but because you recognize the purchase for what it actually is, a receipt for an emotion you stopped needing to prove years ago. Maybe you'll buy a boat eventually. You bought a modest fishing boat for the lake house 4 years ago that way. It passed the same ritual, cost $180,000, and you've used it every single summer weekend since without a flicker of regret. The ritual isn't there to say no, it's there to filter out the noise dressed up as desire. Someday, if anyone ever sat you down and asked how exactly you ended up here, actually asked, past the assumption that it must have been an inheritance or a lucky IPO or some Silicon Valley miracle, the real answer would disappoint almost everyone who asked it. There was no windfall. Your father ran a machine shop that employed 11 people and never once cleared $90,000 in a good year. There was no family money, no early Bitcoin, no lucky ticket. At 29, you took $340,000, most of it borrowed against a house you nearly lost twice in the process, and bought a struggling industrial parts distributor that 3 other buyers had already walked away from because the previous owner had let the operations rot for a decade. For the first 6 years, you paid yourself less than your warehouse manager. You drove a car with 190,000 miles on it, well past the point where anyone would have blamed you for upgrading. You reinvested nearly everything the business generated, year after year, into inventory systems, into better logistics software, before your competitors understood why it mattered, into acquiring 2 smaller regional competitors during downturns when everyone else was too scared to expand. You were, by any honest account, mediocre at prediction and elite at patience. You never called a market top. You never called a bottom. You simply kept showing up to the same unglamorous business for 26 years, while other, smarter people chased faster outcomes and burned out somewhere around year 4. The company crossed $10 million in annual revenue after year 5. It crossed $100 million after year 14. It crossed $1 billion in valuation, the moment that actually made you, on paper, a billionaire, during a year you don't even remember celebrating, because you found out about it from an accountant's email, rather than a headline, 3 weeks after the valuation event had already technically occurred. That's the part that breaks people's mental model of how this is supposed to work. There was no day you became a billionaire. There was a Tuesday, indistinguishable from every other Tuesday, when a number crossed a threshold while you were dealing with a supplier issue in Ohio. The corridor, as you've come to think of it privately, has no windows. Almost everyone who enters it exits early, not because they lack intelligence, but because 26 years of unglamorous, unapplauded repetition is a genuinely difficult thing to sustain when nobody's clapping and the scoreboard doesn't update in real time. Compound growth, whether in a business or a portfolio, only rewards the people who forget they're waiting for it. You leave the office at 5:15. Rick, or the equivalent of Rick, because every neighborhood has one, waves from his driveway, standing next to a boat he financed 2 years ago, and a truck he upgrades every 3. Gesturing toward a home theater system, he's clearly excited to show off to whoever slows down long enough to ask. Rick is, by every visible metric available to the naked eye, winning at something. You don't know Rick's actual financial position, and you'll never ask, because it's none of your business, and because the visible version of wealth was never the interesting version to begin with. You think, without malice, about your own father, laid off at 54 after 22 years at the same plant, standing in the kitchen with a severance check that lasted 4 months, and a look on his face you've spent the rest of your life trying to make sure you never wear yourself. At 19, watching that, you made a decision so quiet you didn't even recognize it as a decision at the time. You simply decided that no external event would ever again have the power to determine whether you and the people you loved were safe. Every identical gray t-shirt, every used vehicle bought in cash, every dollar reinvested instead of spent, during the 6 years you underpaid yourself, that was a 19-year-old keeping a promise nobody else knew he'd made. The neighbors see a modest house, a used SUV, a man who mows his own lawn every other Saturday. They cannot see the promise. That's fine. The promise was never made for an audience. Dinner is with your wife. At the same kitchen table you bought secondhand 18 years ago, back when secondhand wasn't a philosophy yet, just a necessity. She met you before any of this, back when the machine shop's biggest customer nearly canceled a contract and you genuinely didn't know if you'd make payroll that month. She has her own money now, her own board seats, her own foundation she runs with a rigor that occasionally outperforms your own team's. You've had exactly 3 real fights about money in 24 years, and each one ended the same way. A standing Sunday morning ritual, 30 minutes, coffee, numbers on the table, no ambushes. Money conflicts, you both discovered decades ago, are almost never actually about money. They're about being surprised. You eliminated the surprises before the surprises could eliminate anything else. After dinner, you walk the same loop you've walked most evenings for a decade, past houses worth a fraction of what you're worth, owned by people who have no idea what's walking past their mailbox. A podcast you listened to that morning asked its guest, a much younger entrepreneur, what his number was, the number where enough finally becomes enough. You passed your version of that number so long ago, you can't actually locate the moment it happened. No parade arrived, no internal alarm went off. The number simply became a bigger number, and you were still out here, walking the same loop, in the same shoes you've owned for 3 years, thinking about a tuition payment and a boat you didn't buy. That's the part the number never tells you in advance. The finish line was never real. What the money actually delivered arrived years before the number got large enough to be interesting. The day you stopped fearing an unexpected phone call, the day a market headline became background noise instead of a threat, the day you told a board member no and felt nothing but clarity afterward. Wealth at this scale isn't a number anymore. It's the density of problems that simply no longer exist in your life. Tuition, layoffs, market crashes, a bounced payment for someone you love, solved, repeatedly, silently, without applause. You are, functionally, a machine that converts capital into other people's calm, and occasionally your own. Tonight, before bed, you check the family office dashboard one final time. A habit, not a need. Nothing requires your signature. Tomorrow there's a board call, a dentist appointment your assistant scheduled around it, and a foundation meeting about a rural hospital wing that will open next spring under a name that isn't yours, because you asked it not to be. Today you approved a $40 million expansion with 3 sentences, ate a foil-wrapped sandwich indistinguishable from your employees, deleted a $22,000 problem from someone you've loved since you were 19, and declined a boat that would have cost you nothing and meant less. No one clapped. Almost no one knows. Tomorrow the market will open, rise or fall, by some number, with more zeros in it than most people will earn in a lifetime, and you will do, beautifully, almost nothing at all. Because at this size, the money finally stopped needing you to manage it, and somewhere in that silence, so did you. If this is the kind of wealth that actually appeals to you, the quiet kind, the kind nobody claps for, subscribe. There's more of this waiting for you.